Hi guys, so it's been a while, so I'm ready to read the next chapter of Wait Till Helen Comes. We are on chapter 15, and if we remember, they got stuck, Heather and Molly got stuck in the hole in Harbor House, and they're kind of waiting, hoping somebody is going to save them. Hours seemed to pass while Heather slept. The rain stopped. Above my head, I could see a few stars through the holes in the roof. From somewhere in the woods, an owl hooted, and the cricket continued to chirp, safe in his hiding place. Just as I was falling asleep, I heard Michael calling me. Nudging Heather awake, I jumped to my feet. "Down here!" I yelled. "We're down here!" I heard someone carefully enter the room above us. "Careful!" I shouted. "The floor's weak. Heather and I fell through." A flashlight beamed down on Heather and me, and Michael yelled, "Dave, they're in here!" In a moment, Dave was lowering himself cautiously through the hole. Embracing Heather, he cried, "You're all right. Thank God you're all right." "Molly saved me," Heather said, clinging to him. "I almost drowned in the pond, and she saved me." Dave put an arm around me and hugged me against his side with Heather between us. "We've been so worried. What were you doing here?" Before I could answer, I heard Michael gasp, "There's bones down there!" He was crouching above us, beaming his flashlight into the corner where the skeletons lay. In the circle of light, we saw them huddled together, still wearing the rags of their clothing. "They've been here ever since the fire," I told Dave. "They're Helen's parents," Heather added. "You don't have to worry, Daddy. They won't hurt you." Dave did look a little edgy, I thought. "Let's get you home," he said to Heather. "You too, Molly." He hoisted Heather onto the floor above us, and Michael helped her to her feet. Then Dave boosted me up and pulled himself up after me. "Oh, Molly!" Mom was kneeling in the doorway, her arms around Heather. She reached out for me, and I ran to her, clinging to her as shamelessly as a baby. "I've been so scared," Mom said, hugging me tightly. Dave picked up Heather and turned back to Michael. "Come on," he said. "The girls need to get home and have a nice hot bath." Michael was still peering into the darkness of the cellar, playing the beam of his flashlight on the bones. "Isn't it against the law to leave bones lying around unburied?" he asked Mom. She moved cautiously to his side and looked over his shoulder. "They were buried," she said uncertainly. "Until now." "I guess that nobody knew the cellar was there," Michael mused. "Most of the ceiling fell down and blocked this room. If you all hadn't fallen through the floor, those bones would have lain there forever." Dave nodded. He was still standing in the doorway holding Heather. "I'll call the police when we get back to the church," he said. "They ought to be given a decent burial." "Couldn't I keep them?" Michael asked. "I could study them, learn all about them. It would be a great science project." "Michael!" Mom stared at her offspring, obviously shocked. "Well, they have bones in science class, and medical students study them. Why can't I? It's scientific." "They have to be buried with Helen," Heather said. "Families are always buried together." "Like the berries," I said, walking out of the house with Mom. "What are you two talking about?" Dave asked. "You know that little tombstone in the graveyard?" I watched Michael, waiting for him to make a derogatory remark about ghosts, but he was absorbed in shining his flashlight far ahead, watching its beam fan out into a circle as he played it across the woods. "Well," I went on, "Helen Harper is buried there. She lived in this house, and when it was buried, her parents died. Their bones are in the cellar, but they should be buried with Helen, like Heather says." Heather and I looked at each other, firmly united. "Please, Daddy, tell the police so they'll know," she said. "It's very important to you, isn't it?" Dave hugged Heather, and she nodded. "And it's important to Helen, too," she said. "And Molly." Dave smiled at me. "Is this some sort of alliance?" Slipping my arm around Mom's waist, I smiled back. "It sure is," I said. When we got home, Heather and I each had a hot bath and steaming cups of herb tea before we went to bed. After Dave and Mom said goodnight and left us alone in the dark, Heather said, "I'm sorry I told Helen to wreck your things, Molly. If I could, I'd make her come back and fix everything. Your stuff, Michael's, and Jean's, too." "It's all right, Heather. It wasn't your fault. Heather possessed you, I think." "But not anymore," Heather said. "No, she's gone now." "With her mother," Helen yawned. "And her stepfather," I added. "They're a family now." A little whisper breeze puffed the curtains away from the window and set the leaves to murmuring. "Should I tell Daddy about the fire tomorrow?" Heather asked quietly. "I think you'll feel better if you do." "Will he still love me?" Her voice quivered. "I know he will. You saw Helen's mother, the way she hugged her and comforted her. She forgave her, and she hadn't stopped loving her." Heather sighed and turned over noisily. "I'm glad you're my sister, Molly," she said, her voice slurring with sleep. "Me too, Heather." I meant it. For the first time, she seemed like a real true sister instead of an enemy camping in our home, making me and everyone else miserable. The next morning, Dave called the police and told them about the skeletons in Harper House. Although he had to do a lot of explaining, he finally succeeded in convincing Officer Green that the bones should be buried in St. Swithin's churchyard, as close to Helen as possible. When he hung up the phone, Heather ran to his side and slipped her hand in his. "Will you go for a walk with me, Daddy?" she asked. "I need to talk to you about something." I could hear the fear in her voice, but Dave didn't seem to notice. "Sure, honey," he said. "I've got work to do in the carriage house, but I can spare you a few minutes before I get started." I stood at the back door and watched them walk across the yard together, her face turned up towards his head bent down towards hers. Mom stood behind me, looking over my shoulder. "I don't know why," she said, "but Heather seems happier this morning, and last night she really surprised me. She actually let me hug her. Maybe your adventure together at Harper House was just what this family needed to pull it together." I leaned against her, enjoying the feeling of her arms around me. "Would you still love me no matter what I did?" "What do you mean?" Mom asked. "Well," I watched a monarch butterfly fly towards the zinnias growing in the tub near the porch. "Suppose I did something really horrible, and I told you about it a long time afterwards. Would you hate me?" I pulled away from her so I could see her face. Mom smiled, but she seemed a little puzzled. "Are you about to confess to committing a heinous crime?" She made it sound like if she were joking. "You were the one who broke your grandmother's priceless Ming vase all those years ago," she laughed. "No, Mom, I'm serious." I studied her eyes, trying to read the expression in them. "Suppose I caused somebody to die. I didn't mean to, it was an accident, but I was scared to tell you. What would you do if I confessed?" Mom brushed a strand of hair out of my eyes, her hand touching me gently. "Molly, you're not making any sense," she said to me slowly. "Would you still love me? Would you forgive me?" I heard my voice rise like a child's. "That's all I'd want to know. Do parents love their children no matter what they do?" Mom put her arm around me and hugged me. "I'll always love you, Molly. Always. No matter what. You should know that by now." "But how about Dave? Would he?" "Dave?" Mom hesitated as if she weren't sure how Dave fit into all of this. "Not me. Heather. If Heather did something awful, would he still love her?" "Molly," Mom said, sucking in her breath hard, her eyes darkening with concern. "What are you trying to tell me?" "The fire. Heather started it by accident, but she thinks it's her fault her mother died." The words flew out of me as if a dam had burst. "She's afraid Dave will hate her if she tells him." Oh my God. Mom leaned against the doorframe, her hands pressed to her mouth. That poor little girl. That poor child. To keep something like that all bottled up inside all these years. No wonder she's been so closed off and untouchable. "She was playing with the stove," I told Mom. "Somehow a fire started. She hid and her mother died looking for her, I guess. She told me about it last night when we were trapped in the cellar. I thought she should tell Dave." "Is that why she wanted to go for a walk?" Mom stepped out on the porch and gazed across the lawn. "I don't see them anywhere," she said. I gave her the right advice, didn't I? I looked past Mom's still figure toward the graveyard, imagining Heather and Dave sitting near Helen's grave as she told him about the fire. Mom turned back to me, embracing me fiercely. "Of course you did, Molly. Dave will understand." Releasing me, she shook her head. "I never even suspected," she said, more to herself than me. "She must have thought we'd all hate her if we knew." "That's exactly what she did think." "And the ghost? It must have been a projection of her own guilt," Mom said. Before I could think of a good answer, I saw Heather and Dave walking towards us. He was still holding her hand, and they were smiling at each other. When she saw us, Heather pulled away and ran to me, her eyes shining with tears. As Mom hurried to Dave's side, Heather smiled at me. "I told him everything, Molly," she whispered, "and he still loves me. He knows it was an accident." Burying her head in my stomach, she knotted her skinny arms around me and squeezed until it hurt. A few days later, Plummer's funeral parlor sent a hearse to St. Swithin's graveyard. For the first time in almost 40 years, the crows in the oak tree had a funeral to watch. Mr. Simmons himself had supervised the diggings of the graves. The minister from the new church was there, Bible in hand, and a number of people from Hallwell, including a reporter for the Journal. It was almost a festive occasion, I thought, as I listened to the conversations around me. Most of these people knew nothing of the terrible unhappiness that the burial was bringing to an end. At the conclusion of the service, everyone stepped forward, picking up a handful of earth and tossing it into the graves. I heard several of them comment on Heather's tears. What a sensitive child she must be, a stout lady observed, adjusting the angle of her large straw hat. Her companion nodded. You think she knew the poor souls personally? She's probably too young to be exposed to something as tragic as a funeral, the woman in the straw hat said. I never thought little children should be told about death. Why frighten them? Let's keep their innocence as long as we can. The two of them walked toward the car and drove off, leaving us alone, except for Mr. Simmons. Glad to see this is settled, he said, heaping the earth over the graves. She'll rest in peace now, like them. He waved the shovel toward Berry Patch. She's with her own. Heather gazed at the marble angel poised on his pedestal above the berries, his wings uplifted. Daddy should make Helen one of those, she said to me. I think she'd like to have one, don't you? It would look very pretty, I said, watching Mr. Simmons patch the freshly dug earth with his shovel. By September, a small marble angel guarded Helen's grave, and 2 stones flanked hers. Her own name, but not just her initials, marked her burial place, and English ivy softened the mounds of earth over her parents' graves. The cemetery had lost its gloom, and I no longer feared it. One afternoon in early October, Michael, Heather, and I were sitting in a sunny spot not far from Helen's grave. It was a warm, sweet-smelling day, more like spring than fall. Michael was watching a huge wood beetle crawling around in its glass jar prison, and I was reading the borrowers to Heather. Do you want me to read the next chapter? I wasn't sure she'd want me to leave poor Stainless facing a certain capture, but when I looked at her, I realized she hadn't been paying much attention to the story. She was lying on her back, chewing on a blade of grass and staring up the clouds drifting slowly across the incredible blue sky. Do you think she can see us from where she is? She asked dreamily, her mind apparently far from Stainless's plight. I don't know, I said, guessing she was thinking of Helen. This was the first time in weeks that she had mentioned her. Wherever she is, though, she is happy, I added. I'm sure of it. Me too, Heather agreed. She sat up and gazed at the angel under the oak tree. He gazed back serenely, seeming to return her smile. Suddenly, she grasped my arm, her nails biting through the sleeve of my shirt. Molly, she whispered. Look. She got to her feet and ran toward the angel, and I ran after her, seeing what she saw. Something shiny dangled from the angel's outstretched hand, a silver locket turning slightly in the breeze. Before I could stop her, Heather snatched the chain from the angel's stiff fingers. As I watched, it seemed to pop open by itself in her outstretched palm. On one side was a picture of Helen. On the other was a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Heather slipped it out of the frame and spread it flat. We both read the message, written in the same hand I had once seen scrawled on my bedroom wall. With love from Helen, it said, do not forget me. Heather and I looked at each other. The sun warmed our backs as it shone down through the oak's reddening leaves. Bees buzzed in the goldenrod, and a grasshopper bounded away from Michael as he approached us. Where did you get that old thing? He asked, looking at the locket. I thought you lost it last summer. Helen gave it back to me, Heather told him solemnly. It's all right for me to wear it now, she added, looking at me. Isn't it? I nodded, but Michael rolled his eyes skyward. Not Helen again. I thought we heard the last of the ghost stuff. I think we have, I said. Now. Silently, Heather fastened a chain around her neck, smiling at me as she did. Together we walked out of the graveyard. Behind us, Michael kicked at the grass. I still don't believe it, I heard him yell at our backs, but it seemed to me that his voice quavered a tiny bit. And that is it. We are done. Yay! Bye.